I thought I would do better in second service after hearing that song, but it's very disarming, man. There's something about coming before God, and that song in particular is a prayer that I pray every day my kids go to school, that God would be for them, and He would be with them, and that He would go before them and behind them and beside them and within them and above them and below them, that every ear that hears them speak would hear Jesus, every eye that sees them would see Jesus, and it's good to be reminded that sometimes that God is praying that same prayer over us, and He is speaking that truth over us, and that hit. I didn't used to be a crier much until I had kids, and now I'm all, man, it's been like 15 years of just commercials making you tear up. Anyways, go ahead and open up to chapter 11 of Hebrews, and we'll go there today. So this wedding ring has been on my finger pretty much the whole 21 years that I've been married. We got married in May of 2000. And so on the inside of my wedding ring, it says May 6, 2000. You can't see it, but I can. You just trust me. And then it says PROV 3:5-6. And those are verses that some of you are familiar with, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. And they say this, that says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Which is huge. That we wanted this verse to be an anchor for our lives. And it is. That doesn't make the moments easier, because you want those anchor verses, right? So when the storms come, you hang on to this and you're like, I don't know how this is going to go, but I know I'm not leaving here. And this is one of those for us, because there's something to the reality of every one of us has been through. I don't understand. God, I don't understand why this is happening. And it can get really frustrating. And so you speak it out to Him. You're like, God, this doesn't make any sense. And it's nice to be able to come back to this foundation of, I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to trust. So trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding. If you lean on your own understanding, you've been there when your own understanding fails. And I'm confident that if God gave us the answers that we're asking for, that wouldn't really help, because it would be explaining calculus to a 2-year-old. And so the 2-year-old asks you, what is calculus? And you explain, and they're like, well, that doesn't help me at all. That's us. God's ways are so much higher than our ways, and His thoughts are so much higher than our thoughts. Even if He gives us the answer, it's not going to be sufficient. What we want God to do is act like we want Him to act, and that's not how the deal works. But trust is a huge part of faith. If you know anything about Hebrews 11, the title over Hebrews 11 in my Bible is By Faith. I grew up hearing it called the Hall of Faith. It's this series of characters from the Old Testament that lived this amazing life of faith, where they pursued God, not concerned about the consequences. And they really are heroic characters. Now, faith and trust are inseparable. You know, you walk in here and you're all sitting down, and you looked at that chair, and you probably didn't even think about it. It was unconscious. You had so much faith in the chairs that are provided for you, you just sat down. Faith is assessing it and saying, that'll hold me. Trust is sitting down and doing it, right? So trust is an act of faith. And this is how we live a whole lot of our lives. But let's look at Hebrews chapter, actually go back a couple of verses to Hebrews 10:36. And this will help explain some of this. This will tell us why 11 is here. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. If he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Let me read that last one again. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Let me pray for us. God, give us faith. You are the source of faith. You are the substance of faith. And we're asking you to have the faith to believe, because we bring very meager portions to this feast, and you provide everything. And there's some of us who come in here this morning, and we are so weighed down by the life outside of this place that it's hard to hear a word that's said, to sing a word without tearing up. And God, we just ask you to take those burdens right now and give us a peace that we can't explain. In a moment where we should be freaking out, help us to have a heart that is at peace because you are in charge. Not because the circumstance changed, but because our perspective of it shifts to see you. Only you can do this, God. So speak in this moment to hearts that desperately need to hear you. And help us preserve our souls. Amen. So this is it. This is why it's here. You know, if he's going to say all these things about faith in verse 38 and 39, if the righteous ones are supposed to live by faith, if faith is what preserves your soul, we need to know what faith is. Like that's a necessary part of the process. So how about you? Where you sit. Somebody asks you, they're like, hey, you're a church person, right? So you go to work, family, whatever. They say, you're the kind of person that goes to church on Sunday, and you're like, this seems like a setup, but yes. And they say, so what is faith? That's a word that gets thrown around a lot in church circles. So what is that? Think about that. How do you answer that? Like a belief? A strong belief? A hope? The Bible has an answer to this, but I want you to think, like practically, not the answer that you're supposed to give, but like, what do I really think faith is? Let me tell you what Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, what they give as a definition of faith. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but this is inspired word of God, and the answer to what is faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, pretend like you've never heard that before. If you have, some of you are like, I've never heard that before, so that's not hard. But if you have heard it before, I just want you to think of that fresh. This is an example of the sort of thing that when you ask God, will you just tell me what faith is? And then he tells you, you're like, well, that doesn't really help. Because to be sure of what I hope for, that doesn't seem like something I can actually do without pretending. The evidence, the conviction of things not seen, but I can't see it. Like, how can I be certain of something I can't see? And this can be tricky, right? So how do you do it? It's important to dive into the words a little bit. So let's, depending on your translation of the Bible, it comes down to this. Assurance is the really, really important word in this process because the assurance means hypostasis, which means substance. Hypostasis means to stand underneath. So to stand underneath. So substance is a really good definition for this. It's actually better than assurance. Sub is underneath. Stance is to stand. So to stand underneath something. We don't experience a lot of earthquakes here ever. Like I never have. But if there's an earthquake, you're supposed to go stand underneath something that will not fall so that you don't get crushed by the things around you. You want to have faith in something that will stand up when everything else is falling, right? You, on the other side, you want something that can catch you if you fall. And we need to have faith in something that is substantial, to the point where it matters much more what the substance of your faith is in than the amount of faith you have. Tony Evans says it like this, and I love this. If faith has substance, then faith is only as meaningful as the substance to which it is attached. The amount of your faith is not tied to how much faith you have. It is tied to how much substance you possess. A little faith in a significant subject produces great results. A lot of faith in a meaningless substance produces no results. That makes sense, right? I mean, the idea that I don't know if you can come through, but I'm trusting that you can, God, to it's the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And the prophets of Baal are dancing and singing and doing everything they can to get Baal to come down and light this thing on fire. And it just isn't happening because it doesn't matter how much faith you have in something that isn't a thing. Right? I mean, one of the examples I give when I talk about faith to students is it doesn't matter how sincere your faith is, it matters what your faith is in. And so you can sincerely believe, like sincerely, that gravity is no longer a thing for you. Like, great if it is for you, it's just not for me, all right? But I just don't like gravity. Makes everything weird. I like to float. It's just my thing. And so when I drop this pen, it's not going to drop because for me, gravity isn't a thing. And no matter how sincere your belief is, every time, every time because gravity is a thing, and you can choose to deny it, but you can't really see it. Nobody's very good at explaining it, but it's definitely a thing because the pen falls every single time. What is your faith in? What is the substance of your faith? You don't have to have a lot of faith. I have this in my office. It's somebody, I don't know, listen, all kinds of things end up in my office. I don't know how. I got a pile of dishes one time. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. Anyways, so this was and a good thing, though. Somebody dropped off a jar of mustard, like a half jar of mustard seeds. I don't know what they did with the rest of them. Anyway, so when Jesus tells that story about the faith of a mustard seed, they're very, oh gosh, that's a lot. They're very, very small. I know a guy who popped 5 of these in his mouth once. Do they taste like mustard? And they don't. They're super gross. And I found that out by the look on his face, which was hilarious. And and so, anyways, you can't even see these. I'll drop one. You can see it. Woo! It's John's problem now. Anyways, mustard seeds are very small. It doesn't really matter. You can bring the smallest faith into a substantial God. And he says, I can use that. You bring a very big faith to an imaginary God, it doesn't matter at all. There's no substance there. So the substance of what you hope for is everything. The object of your faith is the entire focus of your faith. Our eyes are on Jesus. We follow Jesus. That is the subject of our faith. That is why we can have sincerity. We don't hope in legend or mythology. Our hope lies in the substance. Now, make sure you get this, because I have a lot of people in my life who are like, I just don't really believe that anymore. You're like, it's like just not believing history, because our hope is in a historical moment of the cross when there really was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who really did die on a real cross and really did come back to life. And he didn't do this privately to one guy who said, hey, everybody, guess what I saw? He did this, and 500 people saw him at once. He goes to this guy and to this guy and to this lady and this lady to make sure they know this is a real thing. And to the guy who doubted whether it was true, he showed up to him in a locked room, which isn't a thing unless you're God who can do that thing, and said, put your fingers in the holes. He didn't rebuke him for questioning. He showed up. Our faith is in a God who actually showed up. He is for you. He is with you. It was good when God was standing back from a distance in the Old Testament and he was cheering us on from a distance. You can do it. But when he shows up to be with us, you've never seen the face of God, but when God sends down his son, he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's who our faith is in. So don't feel like this is the fingers crossed, I just choose a mythology and this is the one I landed on. This is a faith of substance. The substance of things hoped for. The conviction of things not seen. This is why he sent out his apostles. Like, he sent out his apostles because those are guys who actually saw it happen. They were there when the thing happened that Jesus rose from the dead. They were there when he put mud on the guy's eyes and the guy could see again. He was there. They were there at the pool of Bethesda when he healed the guy who was able to say, pick up your mat and walk. Okay. They were there to see this stuff. It's not this guy's story, this guy's story, this guy's story. We're reading a firsthand account in the Gospels of the people who were there. We have substance to our faith. And to whatever extent you can believe anything historically, if you can believe that, that's why I tell students all the time, if you can believe that George Washington existed or Julius Caesar existed, you can believe that Jesus existed. Be like, I've never seen any of them. Well, you've never seen Jesus, and so that can't be your reason why not. There is evidence to this. There's substance to it. And unless you think that living by faith is a foreign idea, I just want you to know, literally everybody lives by faith. There can be no financial transactions take place without faith. And I was going to ask you, have you ever been? But let's go back to that time you went through the drive-thru. And so you order, I'll speak for myself. I go through McDonald's and I order the Big Mac, fries, and the Dr. Pepper. And they ask you if you want it bigger, and the answer is yes, but you say it quietly so nobody else can hear. And so yes. And she's like, what'd you say? I'm like, never mind. Anyways, so you pull around the corner, and here's an amazing thing that happens. You pull around to the corner, And this moment of faith happens because here's what happens. And there is something magical about it because you take this piece of plastic and you give her the piece of plastic. Maybe you give her paper instead because you feel like that's more responsible. And so you give them paper or plastic, and they take the plastic like zip, 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 and then they give you back the plastic that you just gave them, and then within minutes, you have food given to you through a window into your car. And you're like, did I just perform a magic trick? I gave them a piece of plastic that they gave back, and I get their food. I understand how economics works, and so I get all that. But there's a certain measure of faith that they have in my piece of plastic that it's going to give them money. And I understand that not that I've ever been there, but sometimes that I've seen other people who are like, this card doesn't work, and so they don't have any faith in my piece of plastic. But the faith on my end is hoping that all the food that I ordered is in the bag. And so do I look at it to make sure, or do I just drive away and have faith that they gave it? Depends on the place. I always check at McDonald's. Chick-fil-A, I never have to check. What were we talking about? The same thing happens when you order online, like you order on eBay. Ordered this stuff on eBay last Christmas, and it's a garage sale online, and so you're like, I want your old stuff to be my new stuff, and so I would like to pay you for your old stuff. I pay them, and then my faith is in them that they're going to send me the thing. And the substance of that faith is how many stars are beside that person's name. And, so far, they've sent me all the things. It doesn't always look like the thing in the picture, but it's close enough. It's functional. And, you're at a garage sale. So every time I think, I get what I get. And this is faith, right? We function like this often. And we don't word it like this, but we function by faith all the time. And we evaluate the substance of that faith. So we can't be too surprised when God asks us to live by faith. So where does that faith come from, though? That's a big part of it. The faith comes from, and listen, I've looked at this verse. I remember memorizing this verse in high school, and it's made a huge difference in my perspective of salvation. But Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 says this: "For by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one can boast." God doesn't want you bragging about your salvation, because the grace that saves you, the unmerited favor of God on your life, is obtained through faith. And that faith is given to you by God. So the faith you have to believe in the grace that saves you comes from the God who saved you, that gave you the grace that saves you. That's the only reason why we're saved. Like, all of the transaction is on his end. You heard Jonathan talk about it for like 3 weeks, about how we are dead in our sin, and he has made us alive. We got back from Daytona a couple weeks ago, and the guy, Louis Giglio, who speaks to these kids every year for the last 12 years that we've been, except for last year, one of the things he says every year that I love, 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 he said, God did not come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people alive. And this is what our faith is in. If your hope is, I got some bad tendencies that I need to make good, you're thinking too small. The problem is, dead people can't ask for help. So we have to have a God do all the work. He comes down to us, he saves us, he regenerates us, he sanctifies us, he makes us like Jesus. And that's what our faith is in. And that's a really freeing thing. So don't let that trap you into thinking, oh, there's so much burden there, I really got to step it up. Like, no, that was never the point. The point is for you to say, praise God, and just worship. And your whole life is lived not of this obligation to keep the rules to make sure God is pleased with you, but as a thank you for all you've done for me. That's a very different approach to obedience and to righteousness. And that's where our faith is. Faith comes from God, which tells you what happens when somebody loses their faith. Again, some of the biggest heartache I've had in 17 years of ministry is watching people who are passionate in their pursuit of Jesus who are like, nah, I just don't really care. And so I sit down with them for conversations, and it's just one long heartbreak because you realize, I don't know that your faith was ever in Jesus. Your faith was in the behavior of Christians. Your faith was in politicians who say they're Christians. Your faith was in an ideology. Your faith was in doctrine. Your faith was never in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ never fails you. All of the other options will eventually fall apart on you. And so you were looking at these Christians, and as long as they behave, I can believe there's a God who's good. Instead of looking at that Jesus and saying, man, I know everybody else is going to fail me at some point, but you give them grace like you give me grace, and my eyes are on you. So what is the substance of your faith? What is the substance? Like, what are you actually leaning on? And he talks through this, because James talks about faith, and James says some hard things. He doesn't pull punches. So James is the brother of Jesus, and in chapter 1 of James, he says, rejoice when you encounter trials of many kinds, because they produce faith. And so what he tells you to do is when the trial comes, when the hard time comes, you're supposed to be like, all right, let's do this. Is that really how I'm supposed to respond? I don't know how to do that. But he says the thing you can rejoice in is that your faith, when your faith meets God's faithfulness, your faith grows. Because when you show up with your mustard seed and a mountain moves, you're like, oh man, God is capable of way bigger things than I thought he was. This is how faith works. In James 2, he follows up by saying, faith without works is dead. He said, if you aren't actually doing the things that you say you believe in, you probably don't believe in the thing you say you believe. And this seems like, well, are you saying that works is required for salvation? No, I'm just saying if I say I love my wife, and that's all I ever do, I don't ever talk to her, I don't ever listen to her, I don't ever come home, but trust me, I really love her. No, you don't. Like, objectively speaking, you don't, because you have no communication and you clearly don't act loving towards her. You know what I'm saying? This is how a relationship works. Faith without works is dead. If you aren't working out your faith, the faith probably isn't there. And that could be a scary thing to hear. And so we have to go back to our source of faith. Ephesians 2:8 is a gift of God. And so you ask God for faith. Now, who is your faith in? There's only 12 times in the whole New Testament that he talks about having a faith in God. Every other time is having your faith in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, that is the focus of our faith. He is the substance of our faith. And faith, we've gone into it about as much as we can in this short time, but one of the beautiful things about the honesty of the Bible is understanding this is a hard one to get. So it's much better seen than explained. So he's going to give you a bunch of examples here for the rest of the chapter. We're actually going to spend the next couple weeks unpacking this chapter because there's so many amazing stories through Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 is like a clip show of all the highlights of the Old Testament. And if you remember, back before on-demand television, if you're born after 2000, this is meaningless to you. But there used to be this thing where you could only watch TV when it was on. And so when the show came on at 8 o'clock on a Thursday, that's the time you can watch it. If you miss it, you don't get to see that show, like ever, until maybe you catch it in the summer on a rerun. And if you have to go to the bathroom during that show, nobody's pausing it, because there's no such thing as pause. You just keep on. Anyways, the olden days. And so what they would do is, after like 100 episodes, they would be like, hey, you want to see the funniest parts of Seinfeld or Cheers? And they would have like a clip show where they showed you all these funny parts. This is like a clip show of the most faithful parts of the Old Testament. And he goes through it, starting at the beginning. And he says in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So he goes all the way back to Genesis 1:1. If you're going to go back to the beginning, this is the right place to be. In fact, I think a lot of us struggle with this idea that, God, I know my circumstance, and there is no way you make this into something good. There is nothing here to turn into something good. I know that guy, he is pure evil, and there is no way you make him something good. And you go back to creation, and he's like, I've been making things out of what you can't see since the beginning. I've been turning nothing into something from literally day one. That's my whole thing. So if you think I don't have anything to give, he's like, I can use that. I turn nothing into something all the time. That's what makes me God. And it's remarkable to think how clearly he puts it. I mean, he goes back to Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know what he made it out of? Nothing visible. He spoke into being everything that existed. And this is the crisis of faith for every human. Everybody has to reconcile with this. Everybody has to wrestle with the reality that we came from somewhere. How did we get here? How did humanity get here? And I just want to put it out there, lest somebody say, cool that you believe in faith, I believe in science. We're all people of faith. There is a tremendous amount of faith that goes into something came from nothing. We say something came from nothing because there is a God who was always there before the something that could speak it into existence. They would say, but where did that God come from? And we'd be like, he's just always been. And they're like, that's not possible. And you're like, I totally agree, except unless you're God, you can do that? Like, when you're there at the beginning, how does that work? I don't know. And if you spend your time wrestling with it, your brain will cramp up. And so it's okay to just say, I'm okay with the mystery. There's parts of God I'm not meant to understand. And like we said, that's okay. You don't want to understand. You don't want to try to understand everything God's doing because you can't. And you don't want a God that you can understand. So we have a God who has always been, and he speaks into existence everything that is. And if you believe in science, you believe that we came, and I'm very pro-science, but if you believe that we came here from a big bang, you believe that something appeared out of nothing, and as a result of that, chaos turns to order, and an ever-expanding universe leads to us sitting here talking right now with consciousness. And there's a lot of steps in between there, but it takes a lot of faith to say that something came from nothing with no source. We're all people of faith, is how this goes. And honestly, I don't know a lot about the science of it, but I think the remarkable moment a few years ago when they came out with one of the ways that something can come from nothing is something called the God particle. You're like, oh, you're so close. It's so close. Like, just take off the word particle. You're like right there. Even the particle that you can't understand how things got here out of nothing is named after the God who made it. Anyways, faith is necessary to believe. And even when he, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, he says, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus made everything. Why did he make it? For him. How does he hold it together? By him. He's the whole story. He is the focus and the substance of our faith. If your faith is somewhere else, don't be surprised when you show up to the culmination of that faith and feel empty, like there's a lack of substance. Because if your hope was in money or health or success or power or a well-behaved kids, like whatever the something is, you get there and you're like, this is supposed to mean more. Why does this feel empty? Because there was never anything there. Those things are all good, but only because they exist within a God that has given us those blessings. And outside of that, they're insufficient gods. So verse 5, he starts telling stories. By faith, Enoch was taken up. Verse 4. By faith, Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. He's walking through Genesis in the beginning, and then Cain and Abel, right? Abel offered a good sacrifice to God. His heart was right. He recognized the sacrifice that covered the sins of his parents, Adam and Eve. That same sacrifice should be given to God on behalf of his own sin. This is why in verse 2, it says, for by it the people of old received their commendation. These are the people of old. And the commendation that Abel receives is because he brings a sacrifice worthy of the God who has saved him. He brings, now tell me if this sounds familiar. He recognizes his sin, so he brings a sacrifice of blood so that God can impute righteousness to him and to bring them back and reconcile a relationship with each other. That sounds an awful lot like what we sing about here. That is the Christian faith. The Christian faith is the oldest faith because it existed like Genesis 3:15, 6 verses after sin shows up. I will send the seed of the woman to crush the serpent's head. And from that moment on, there's been to look forward to the Messiah. How did the people of old receive their commendation? Because they were looking forward to Jesus Christ. How do we receive our commendation? We look backwards to the person of Jesus Christ. He has always been the substance of faith. They were looking forward to the Messiah to come. We look back to the Messiah who showed up and who's coming again. That's the gospel. That's why it's good news. It frees you up from the obligation to perform for God's pleasure. He already did it. It's not on us. And so Abel offers the sacrifice. And I think it's really interesting that he chose verse 5, Enoch. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God has taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And that's pretty much what we know about Enoch. He gets 3 verses in Genesis 5, which say the same thing, that he was taken up and Enoch was no more. We found out here because he pleased God. Not because he angered God and had to be taken out, but he pleased God, and so God took him. I don't know that story, but 100 years from now, when all of us are in heaven, let's go find Enoch and have a conversation. Let's be like, what happened there? There's a lot of story that was left out. And what we do know is that he pleased God, which is what do I have to do to go there? Well, verse 6, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Without faith it is impossible to please him. So if we go back to Wednesday, I believe it was, I'm working through sermon stuff, getting this ready for you guys. And if you don't have the Bible app, you should download the Bible app, get it on your phone. And so many good Bible studies are on there. But they also do something called the story. So every week or every day, they have a short devotional. If you're not sure what to read, you just tap your way through somebody who is like a worship leader or an author or a pastor or something. They're a spiritual leader who shares a 2-minute devotional about a Bible verse. And then you can read the Bible verse. They give you something to pray. It's really cool. On Wednesday, the one who's doing is N.T. Wright, who is an excellent pastor and author and just has the most beautiful British accent that you've ever heard in your whole life, the kind that you think, I wish he could just read me a story every night and I'd fall asleep and have the best night ever. So, seriously, you got to watch. Anyways, I see N.T. Wright's doing it. I'm like, oh, fantastic. And so, turns out his verse is Hebrews 11:6, which is always nice when God gives you a little nod like, hey, I'm here with you this week. Let's do this. And so here's what N.T. Wright points out that I thought was fascinating. He said, isn't it interesting? In the rest of the Bible, there's the assumption, since it's written by God, that God exists. The honesty of the Bible is that there are authors who recognize there's a lot of people who don't think that. So if you want to draw near to God, without faith it is impossible to please him. Verse 6, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Listen, don't complicate this. You can't really draw near to a God that you don't believe exists. So if your frustration is, I feel like God and I are really separate, but I'm not really sure he's there. I'm just challenging you, and I don't mean this to be condescending. Like, you have to lean in. You have to lean into the belief that he is there. And I'm not saying, again, not a blind faith, a faith of substance in a historical moment that made evident the love of a God for a humanity that he already claimed for his own. So this isn't an empty faith. But you do have to believe that he exists in order to draw near to him. And then he says that he rewards those who seek him. So what does he reward those who seek him with? It's fascinating because he rewards those who seek him with him. Like, he is the reward. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, is like, listen, I am the one who calls you to leave. I am the one who is the destination, and I'm the one who gets you there. I'm the whole story. He is the substance of our faith. Everything hinges on Jesus Christ. So he rewards those who seek him. Faith in Christ is what saves. The problem is, things don't always go like we want, right? I mean, everything, okay, this is cool that you're laying this out and that faith has a substance to it. But if everything is really held together by him, created by him, for him, and in him all things hold together, that actually makes me less comfortable because I see the way things are and I'm not okay with the way things are because things are pretty messed up in a good portion of my life and the rest of the world. So how can that God be in charge of everything and it be going like it is? And there's no easy answer to that. But that's the place to sit in that James 1 talks about where he says, you can rejoice in your trials because you're about to experience faith. So I was trying to think of a way to illustrate this, and I want you to hear from somebody else who has a story about how God showed up in his life and put faithfulness on display. So we have interns every summer, and our man Kyle Jones is leaving on Friday, so I want you to hear from him and how faith showed up in his life. So welcome up Kyle Jones, everybody.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I'm Kyle, and I'm also the mustard seed guy that ate the mustard seeds, and I promise, just don't do it. It burns here and here. Doesn't feel good. But I've loved being at this church. I loved serving in the youth group. We had an awesome time in Daytona for the Passion Conference. Got to hear from those speakers like Louis that Travis was saying. And I just wanted to say that this church has a rare community. I've never been to a church that was so welcoming and so intentional to invite me over to their house and have me eat lunch or take me out to coffee or take me kayaking, which I went kayaking and then later found out that the next day, the river I went kayaking on, someone got attacked by an alligator. So I was like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But no, it's been really awesome being here. And yeah, so I have two stories. And when I think about faith, I think about you hear like childlike faith, and it just reminds me of a story of my little brother. He was probably 3 years old. His name is Matthew. And I grew up skateboarding, and I took him, and my dad was with me to a skate park, and he was on a little, you know those little push scooters that it doesn't have pedals, and the kids just kind of, that was kind of a bad illustration, but they push along, and they're just using their feet, and my brother, he goes to a ramp that's probably the size, it's a half pipe, probably the size of like one of these poles. And he is just gonna go for it. And my dad just runs over there as fast as he can, grabs him off of his bike, and is telling him like, hey, you will get hurt if you do that. But he just had so much faith, like everything was gonna be fine. This is a cool ramp. I'm on a little push bike. I'm gonna be good. And so I bring up that story with my brother because later you'll hear more about him. But yeah, I have two stories. The first one is just practical of something that can go through day to day. And so I, after high school, went to Australia for YWAM. And YWAM stands for Youth with a Mission. So it's a bunch of young kids out of high school that go down and you don't know who anyone is. So you meet at this house in Australia, and they have locations all over the world. And we go through classes about God and just learn about God's character and the Holy Spirit, and go through the Bible. and we go out on an outreach, and my team went to Thailand and Cambodia. And so we went to Thailand, and one of the first things that we had to do was we had to go to the elderly community in the dump system. And their houses are just made out of cardboard. They're built over swamps that are just full of trash. And a lot of these people don't have help around their house, so they're most of the time just laying there in bed waiting for someone to come and give them food. And so we had to go and we had to clean their houses, and we got to do that for them. And it was really interesting. We had a cup full of sticks to pull out which part of the house we were going to clean. And, of course, I got the bathroom. So that was everything was everywhere. I'll just say that. And I remember just sitting there like, oh, man, this is going to be the longest day ever. I'm going to have to clean up all of this poop, all of this pee, and it's going to be a long day. So I just sat there, and I was like, God, I really need you. I don't want to do this. I need you to come in and help me get through this time. And I put on some worship music, and after I prayed, and I was cleaning, and then I just kept cleaning, and I was like overwhelmed by peace in that moment when I was cleaning the bathroom. And I remember we were getting ready to go, and the people were like waiting outside for me, and they're like, oh, geez, you're done finally. And I was like, what do you mean? I thought I was only in there for like 30, 45 minutes, and they're like, you've been in there for like 2 hours. And I was like, oh, what? I had no idea. So God really came through in that time, but he also comes in through the really big things. And so I was in high school. I was a junior, and I got a call from my mom, and she told me to come home. She was screaming. She was crying. She said, come home right now. Just run past your teachers. Don't even tell them that you're leaving. Like, get here. And so being the kid that I was during that time, I was not the best kid. So I was like, oh, no, my mom found out something, and I'm going to be in so much trouble. That wasn't the case, but I went home, and my parents weren't always the most super affectionate parents. Like, so I walked in, and my mom and my dad both were crying, and they hugged me, and I was like, oh, man, like, what's going on? And they told me that my sister, so this happened 2 months after she got married. She was 21, and she had a blood clot in her leg that spread all the way up to her lungs and then split into both sides of her lungs. And she had a pulmonary embolism, and she had CPR done on her for 90 minutes, and she was pronounced dead 7 times and came back to life. And she was in a coma. And hearing that, I mean, the first thing that I immediately did was, well, first start crying, but then calling as many people as I could to start praying for her. And so what happened was she was on birth control after she got married, and that's what started the blood clot in her leg. And so she was in Phoenix, Arizona, and so we flew out that night to go see her. And I remember just getting there and walking into the hospital room, and she had a million wires just running into her head, and she had just, her chest was just beating so hard because she had the trach in her throat that was breathing for her. And she remained in this coma for 2 months, and we were in the hospital room. It was me and my dad, and the doctor came in and said she has 0% chance to live. And my parents were asking questions like, well, like, what does that mean? Like, can we push her around in a wheelchair? And will she be functional in any way? Like, could she hear us, even though she wouldn't be able to talk or like wake up? They were just getting really desperate with their questions for just any hope. And the doctors basically were just like, no, she has no chance of any quality of life. And so I was running out of the room, and I was just so mad, and I was just hitting the walls, and then the next day they had to set the date to turn her life support off, and she was just going to go. And so they told us, or my parents came in and told me, yeah, we have the date set. We're going to turn her life support off. So the day before, we had all of our family members and people that weren't even believers there praying with us. And a lot of my sister's husband's friends and my sister's friends were there, and we prayed over her all night. And then in the morning, they did an MRI. This was the day of that they were going to turn it off. And the MRI showed that all of her brain damage and all of her blood clots vanished overnight. And so that was truly amazing. Like, me and my uncle were running. Like, when you say like jump, you hear like jump for joy. We were literally jumping for joy, running around. And my uncle wasn't a believer, and he got to see that, and he's a believer now. And a lot of the doctors said that there was no chance that this was like anything scientific, that this had to be a miracle, and doctors came to Christ. And I brought up my little brother because during that whole time, he was like 5, 6 years old, and we were praying, and I was getting kind of mad at him because I was like, you don't understand what's going on, but he's 5, so of course he doesn't. And he was just like so calm through the whole entire process of the 2 months. And I remember one day I was asking him, I was like, why are you so calm? Like, do you not understand what's going on? And he said, well, we prayed, didn't we? And I was just like sitting there like, wow. Like, I wish I had that kind of faith like he did, and I could have just sat there and been like, well, we prayed, didn't we? And so it was really cool to see that through my little brother. But now my sister is in Idaho. She has a house. Since the accident, they told us that she wasn't going to be able to walk or talk for maybe 3-4 years. And she was walking and talking perfectly the way she was in a couple of weeks. And she did go blind from everything. And it's not damage to her eyes, but it's just a little nerve in the back of her brain that's not damaged, but it's turned off, so something can spark that, and she'll get her full vision back. But she's doing like eye exercises and stuff every day, and it's coming back slowly. Some days are better than others, but she's just the most joyful person I've ever met, and really inspiring. I've not heard her complain once about her eyes. She makes jokes about it to our family, and we're like, that's not funny. We were on the other side of this. My dad's like, too soon. He's like, it'll probably be too soon in like 10, 15 years because of how traumatic it was. But I just want to encourage you to, like Travis was saying, that in endurance and just holding on to God and holding on to these stories like mine, and like I'm sure a lot of you have had in your own life, to just renew your faith and use that to just keep going. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to try to tell that story myself. It's amazing. And the reality is that it doesn't always work out like that, though. And we've been on the other end of a lot of those stories where there isn't a miracle. But I think it's important to know that it can happen. And so when you pray, you pray with listen, one way or another, the healing is going to come. One way or another, the healing is going to come. But in the moment, it doesn't make sense. And so I know we're supposed to trust in the Lord with all our heart and don't lean on our own understanding, but all I can understand right now is that this is objectively wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. I mean, she didn't take a bad drug and now things are gone sideways. I mean, she took a medication that had a side effect that was detrimental. And it reminds me of the story in the book of John where he talks about, remember the story of Lazarus, raising Lazarus from the dead? And there's a point where Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. And he was their friend. Like, Jesus was their friend, sincerely. And so when he heard, the next verse says, and so he waited 2 days before he left. And in that 2 days, Lazarus died. And so when Jesus does show up, his sisters say, where were you? If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. You ever had that conversation with God? God, where were you? That wouldn't have happened to them. That wouldn't have happened to me. If you had just been here, where were you? And in that moment, there is no way that you can see, like, we know the story, like, we know what's about to happen, but just put yourself in that moment. You're like, there is no way that this is okay. He's dead. There's no coming back from that. And he doesn't condemn her. He just says, I am the resurrection. I am the life. And she says, I know there's going to be resurrection when you return and everybody rises from the dead. He's like, no, you don't understand. And so he goes over to the tomb and he speaks into the tomb and he says, Lazarus, come forth. And the sisters had already told him, and King James says, Lord, that's a bad idea, for he stinketh. And because after 3 days, that's what happens to a dead body. And the Jewish tradition was after 3 days, the soul has left the body, and there's no coming back from that. And so Lazarus, come forth. And I heard somebody say the reason why he said Lazarus, come forth, is because if he just speaks into the tomb and says, come forth, you got all kinds of dead bodies coming out who are alive. It's like, no, I just want Lazarus. And so Lazarus rises up, and he comes out. And still wrapped in his grave clothes, and everybody is losing it. Like, what is happening? And so somebody unwrap him. And the grave clothes stink of death, but he is alive. And Jesus has saved him. And as remarkable as that is, I think there's a lot of us who are like, see, that's the kind of evidence I'm looking for. If I could just see God do a moment like that, if I could just have a story like Kyle's where I saw it happen, I'm like, oh man, you really can do that. Then I would believe. Other than the actual resurrection part of that story, the most amazing part of that story is the end of it, where it says, many who saw what happened to Mary's brother believed. You catch that first word? Many? Why doesn't that say everyone? Everyone who saw that dead guy come alive again believed. There were some people who saw Lazarus, the dead man that they knew, get up out of the grave and walk out and have to be unwrapped, or were like, I just don't think so. Like, I just don't think that's enough for me. I mean, maybe if you show me something else, I got to see it. Like, if you don't believe that, like, what are you waiting for? There are people who saw Jesus rise from the dead and just got angry about it instead of being like, wait, you said you were going to come back from the dead and you did it? The only response is worship. That's your only response. But instead, they don't believe. So the substance of our belief isn't on what our eyes can see. The substance of our belief is in Jesus, and he loves you. Where you sit, not some future version of you that has things figured out, but where you sit, he loves you now. And everything hinges on that. And it's the same God. You know what? If you have your Bibles, go back to Numbers chapter 6. Numbers chapter 6. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, your fourth book. Numbers chapter 6. I want you to see this for yourself because I think it's important. The God in whom we have faith, the one who rose from the dead for you, to save you, to seek you out. At the end of this chapter, in the Old Testament, it's titled Aaron's Blessing. And tell me if this sounds familiar. Verse 22 on. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." You know one of the most amazing things to me? The face of God, the holiness of God should inspire terror in sinners like us. And you know what he says? His face shines upon you and gives you peace. That's not the God that so many of us are waiting to strike us down for our sin. The God in whom we have faith is the God who sees you and brings you peace. If the God that you're putting your faith in is just waiting to smite you, you're not worshiping the God of Jesus Christ who showed up and died for you so he could welcome you to his throne of grace. That's who we worship. And you know what? Sometimes he saves in the moment. Sometimes he doesn't. There was a point where Lazarus had to die again, which is a weird sentence. He had to die again, but he did. And we will get raised from the dead, never to die again. And we get to spend eternity in heaven. What is the substance of your faith? And that's something only you can answer in your heart. Your behavior will follow your faith, but in this moment, assess that for yourself. Ask God, what am I having my faith in? God, thank you that you lift up your face to shine upon us and give us peace. And we know what we deserve, and I pray that our faith would be in a God who brings grace. Let my faith be in a God who brings grace. Thank you for each one of these men and women, and whatever you have for them today, I pray that they would be men and women of faith who trust in a God who is so much bigger than what they see possible. Thank you for saving Kyle's sister, and thank you for the way you work your sovereignty and your goodness into every person here. In your name we pray. Amen.